So I'd like to begin by giving you a very big welcome to the second lecture in our fascinating series of travel destinations throughout the year. What I've been doing in this series has been to begin each lecture by introducing you to a member of the ASA staff. So last time it was Kristen Hellstrom, Director of ASA. This evening, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Julia Kelly, who has joined us this evening. Julia did her PhD in Pompeian art, which is an amazing topic. I've been lucky enough to work with Julia on several of my tours and also to travel with her. She's wonderfully knowledgeable, incredibly well-read, always an absolutely marvellous tour manager and leader. So I'd like to introduce you now to Dr. Julia Kelly, who is a very important and integral part of the ASA team. So hi, Julia, great to have you with us.
Hello, Susanna, and hello to everybody. As people have been joining, I've been looking at your names, and I know that I have travelled with so many of you before, which makes me realise I have been at ASA for coming on for 20 years next year. So hopefully there's a cake in my future, Kristen. At the moment, I'm working on a couple of tours, including Susanna's Literary Scotland. And I know I've seen a few names pop up as well who are on the Scotland tour. So you've got some fabulous things ahead of you there. And Susanna, I have also been today talking to Tokyo. And you are in for some spectacular cherry blossom. They're putting on a display
so
for you,
great.
Especially
Fabulous.
For you, even if it isn't an ASA tour.
And I'd just like to add that Julia is really responsible for my Scandinavian tour. She and I had done a wonderful tour together. We were sitting at the airport waiting to go home. And Julia said to me, "Oh, what's next, Susanna?" And I mentioned various places, and she said, "Look, you haven't thought of Scandinavia." So she was the one that planted that idea in my mind, and the result was one of the most exciting tours I've ever done to Scandinavia. So thank you for that, Julia. I'm very grateful indeed for that idea.
It was me and the glass of wine that you bought me at the airport, Susanna.
That must have been it. Thank you, Julia. Okay, it's now my very great pleasure to introduce Sandra McMahon to you. Sandra is a horticulturalist, a landscape designer, also a lecturer, and she has taken tour groups to Belgium, Germany, the UK, and also during COVID restrictions to wonderful gardens in Australia. Sandra has a couple of fabulous tours planned to Belgium and the Rhine Valley. One of those is in June this year, and that tour is now fully booked. But she will be repeating that tour from the end of May, 29th of May to the 18th of June next year. So I'm sure ASA would be delighted to hear from anyone who wishes to book for that tour. So Sandra is going to tell us this evening about tradition and innovation in Belgian landscape design. So welcome, Sandra. Over to you. We're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the welcome, and I regard it as quite an honour to be invited to talk in this lecture series, and I really must acknowledge Kristen, who had the original idea to organise a trip to Belgium, and I think that was quite an inspirational idea. Now, tradition and innovation in Belgian landscape design is my topic, of course. And I'd like to commence by setting the scene. Belgium, which we can see here, is indeed a relatively small country. The United Kingdom is 8 times larger than Belgium, and Australia is in fact 254 times as large. And here we've got the entire country of Belgium overlaid on Greater Melbourne in Victoria. To the uninitiated, Belgium often seems somewhat enigmatic and an unknown entity. Most people have heard of Belgian chocolate, Belgian lace, linen and tapestry, and many of course would know that Agatha Christie's beloved detective Hercule Poirot was in fact Belgian. And the beloved Belgian cartoon character of Tintin and his dog Snowy are as recognisable across Europe as Mickey Mouse in the rest of the world. And comic art is another very interesting export from Belgium. And on arguably a more serious level, most of us would also have heard of some of the terrible battles that have been fought in Belgium, ranging from Waterloo to Ypres and Passchendaele. I wonder how many of us know that the term Art Nouveau was first coined in Belgium, and that the first Art Nouveau architecture is to be found in cities like Antwerp and Brussels. And here on the left, we have the entry foyer of the famous Hotel Tassel in Brussels, designed in 1893 by the great Art Nouveau Belgian architect Victor Horta, whose work around Brussels and in other Belgian cities is quite extensive. Notice the most wonderful sinuous curves reflected not just on the wall but in the mosaic work on the floor. On the left, we have the Seagull building called Les Mouettes, which is in Antwerp, and truly there are street after street that offer a feast of Art Nouveau architecture in cities like Antwerp and Brussels. This, I think, is a fabulous building. It's the Old England building in Brussels, built in 1899. I draw your attention to the facade. It's entirely constructed of metal and glass, and this was an aspect of Art Nouveau architecture. This building was originally a department store, and the use of glass was pioneered so that the term window shopping sort of came into being, because that really radicalised the way people could view what was on offer inside in the way of merchandise. This fabulous building it now houses the Museum of Musical Instruments in Brussels. And on that note, another famous export of Belgium, of course, is the saxophone invented by Adolphe Sax. And this museum is marvellous, has a fantastic collection of really fascinating instruments, including a sort of prototype giant saxophone that you would need a wheelbarrow to move around. So I'd like to think that I could help you see that Belgium, despite its size, really does punch above its weight in so many areas. And here we see a political map of Belgium, and to the north, the Netherlands, to the southeast, France, Germany over here. And I'll just point out the major cities: Brussels, the capital, Ghent, Bruges, and over here closer to the Netherlands, Antwerp. And I think for some reason, historically, the famous cities have developed in the north of the country, which is Flanders. It's one of the most prosperous countries in Western Europe. It has a very rich cultural tradition, magnificent fine art and architecture, and an enviable cuisine. The Northern Renaissance was born in this part of the world, in Flanders. Without going into a complex history of how Belgium acquired its present shape, I'll just summarise a few things. It has always been one of the most contested regions in Europe. It was part of the Roman Empire, and then the Franks seized control. It became part of Charlemagne's empire and passed through Burgundian control to the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs. And the modern shape actually includes 10 of the so-called 17 provinces within the Burgundian Netherlands. And not terribly important, I know, but a little bit of trivia here. Just south of Brussels, Walloon this is the area where French is spoken. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But we have the area of Brabant, and I suspect we've probably got a few rose growers and gardeners here who may, in fact, know the very popular tea rose, the Duchesse de Brabant. And the title Duke or Duchess of Brabant is equivalent to the title Prince of Wales in the United Kingdom. So the heir to the throne is always known as the Duke or Duchess of Brabant. And the present heir is actually Princess Elizabeth, who is the current Duchess of Brabant. So a little bit of trivia. This is a map to illustrate where different languages are spoken. And the question of a national language remains a very hot issue in Belgium. The Dutch/French language divide has existed more or less since Roman and Frankish times. In other words, for over 1,500 years. In the north of the country, this green area is Flanders, and 59% of the population reside in that area, and the people who are known as Flemish speak Dutch. Flemish is a close relative of Dutch. It's almost a dialect. And to the south, the red area is where French is spoken, and the region is known as Wallonia and contains about 31% of the population. And there has always been quite a lot of animosity between the idea of speaking French, or French speakers and Flemish speakers. And I know I was warned of this. And when I was there just recently, I went into a shop, and I don't speak Flemish, I can speak German, but they are a little bit different. And so I embarked on a question in French, and I could see straight away the reaction wasn't terribly friendly. So the advice is to speak English if you're in Flanders. But despite those divisions, in a sense, all these areas are united by religion, which is, of course, Catholicism. I should have pointed out that this striped area, this is Brussels, which is officially a bilingual city, and both languages are the official languages of Brussels. So both areas are united by religion, Catholicism, and this situation dates back to the 16th century, when the Protestants, who were quite numerous in this part of the world, were forced to move north into what is now the Netherlands, and the Catholics stayed behind. Just a very brief summary of the way modern Belgium has arisen. The French under Napoleon were, of course, defeated in 1814, and I mentioned Waterloo before, and you can visit the site of the Battle of Waterloo. It's not that far from Brussels. And the new United Kingdom of the Netherlands was formed. And at the same time, Luxembourg, which had, along with what is now Belgium, suffered quite a lot of invasion by other powers, was also granted independence, and the monarchy was established in Belgium, and Luxembourg is a grand duchy. So there was a revolution between 1830 and 1838, and that area split into these three nations. And I should have mentioned that the fact that Belgium and Luxembourg suffered so much, particularly in the 20th century during the World Wars, probably accounts for the fact that both those countries were, from the very start, avid supporters of the European Union. I think that bruising history was responsible for that. Anyhow, let's get on to some gardens. I thought I'd do this roughly chronologically and take you first to a gorgeous city, which I know many of you will be familiar with. This is Bruges, where the white swans are sacred. There's quite a lot that could be told about that, but I think time won't permit here. But it is a picture postcard place, and I don't believe it is spoilt by tourism. It's just absolutely lovely, magical. Now we're visiting the Béguinage in Bruges, and the Béguines were a Christian lay religious order, particularly active in the Low Countries in the 13th to 16th centuries. And they were believed to have been, the order was formed, it is believed, for the widows of men who went off to the Crusades. And these women were able to resort to a sort of pious life on the death of their husbands. And the Béguine is a rectangular arrangement of these beautiful houses with a large rectangle of now sort of natural meadowland in the middle. And there are also more private sort of gardens. And the idea was that these women could live here in safety. And the people who live in these places, and many Belgian cities have a béguinage, still offering accommodation for largely for women who, for various reasons, need to be living alone. I said it's not a religious order. In the past, the way of life was to be modelled on the life of Christ through voluntary poverty and caring for the poor and the sick and some religious devotion. And stepping outside there, we're now on that same canal I showed you a few minutes ago. This is known as Lover's Bridge, and you can cross the canals here. Water is everywhere in Belgium, you'll see this. But this amazing little place here is a very historic medieval building on the corner. And as you come off the bridge, you actually walk through the front entry and then disappear off around to the left. And it was acquired back in the 1950s by the family of someone we're going to see shortly. And they restored the building totally using building materials and furniture from the Middle Ages. And it is now a very, very upmarket bed and breakfast. And apparently the present King of Belgium spent his honeymoon there. And I could see this bit of greenery popping over the fence here, over the wall. And the man whose parents had renovated the place said to me, well, you know, you could try going to the door. So when I was there last year, I knocked on the door just to see if we could gain access. And the owner is now an artist, and he was extremely friendly, very hospitable, and invited me inside and took me out the back into this is his garden. You can imagine how rare it is to have such a private garden in the middle of a city like Bruges. And so between that cathedral and this garden wall is, of course, that canal. So we're hoping to go there with our ASA visitors sometime soon. I'm now moving on to the Polder Country, and inland from the Belgian coast lie what are called the polders, and this flat and fertile land used to suffer from flooding by the sea, and it's now totally dry except for obviously the canals here, which are well channeled. And this has been achieved over centuries using sluices and dikes, and the same situation as in the Netherlands. And it is largely protected from tidal erosion. The first embankments in Europe were constructed here in Roman times. And the first polders, the drained area of land, was constructed from the 11th century onwards. Notice the angle at which these trees grow. It's a lovely part of the world for cycling and walking. And I arrived here by walking along what was a Roman road, and the evidence of past civilizations is fairly easy to find in the landscape in many parts of Belgium. Notice the predominant wind direction. This was a very friendly cow that greeted me. It's a breed that you see a lot in that part of the world. We're now at Oostkerke Castle, and this castle is now owned by the aristocratic Van Elst family, and here we see Count Robert van der Elst, and it was his parents who had renovated that lovely little bed and breakfast. I should have mentioned the name of the bed and breakfast was White Knights. Robert's grandmother was a great friend of the Dutch designer Mien Roos, and she was, in her own right, a very keen and creative gardener, and she was greatly influenced by Gertrude Jekyll. And the shot at the start was in this garden, and she did plant some wonderful borders there, and that was the influence of Gertrude Jekyll. They certainly looked, before and after the Second World War, to English gardening traditions. So this is within the grounds of the Oostkerke Castle. You can see the swans have right of passage anywhere they want to go. You can imagine the penalty for killing a swan is almost capital punishment. But everywhere water and lots of flipped hedges. Looking out to the side of that garden, you see in the distance, a fairly common sight in that part of the world, this beautiful windmill, but everywhere the influence of the prevailing winds and the sea. Some more scenes here. and another view of those lovely borders. The whole garden has been constructed on the footprint of the original castle, which I think we'll see a bit of in a minute, espaliered pear trees there. The way the garden's laid out I found quite ingenious, because you can see where the ramparts of the original castle were. The castle itself has long gone, but the footprint of the castle is preserved everywhere in the paths there. But I think it's a lovely garden. And this is a little cameo off to the side, the Garden of the Virgin. And it was created for Count Robert's mother, who I believe is quite a religious person. And it was designed as a place of quiet contemplation, and really references the old medieval idea of the hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden. And there's lots and lots of symbolism in the plants here. So on the right, I'd like you to look at this painting by someone who is still nameless, but he's referred to in the art world as the master of the embroidered foliage. And you can see here, of course, the Virgin and the Christ child, but you notice the lilies. And so in Robert's mother's garden, of course, Lilium candidum, which is highly symbolic. And in the foreground here, I don't know whether you can identify what we have here. On the left, of course, strawberries, lily of the valley, various other plants that were quite significant in medieval times. And the strawberry leaves, I wonder if you could think what the symbolism there might be. I was quite intrigued to learn this. It's regarded traditionally as a symbol of the Trinity. And if you look at strawberry leaves, they're tripartite, so the three elements to the leaf. So way back in the Middle Ages, people were incorporating ideas like this into art. Moving on a little more to Oostkerke Castle, which is not very far from the city of Ghent, and it's a most elegant and majestic castle. It's actually regarded as one of Belgium's finest castles, and it's a unique example of something called the Hispanic Flemish architectural style. So if you look slowly, you might identify Hispanic features, but this would go back to the time when this part of the world was part of the Spanish Netherlands. And it was built as a pleasure palace, and you notice the beautiful use of water. Speaking of water gardens, another great garden is that at Art Nouveau, and these gardens are located between the cities of Namur and Dinant, and the castle is still owned by the family of the man who designed the gardens, and in fact was largely responsible for building the house, and that is the Montpellier family. And the gardens really are quite an ingenious design. Everything in the way of water works entirely manually and naturally without any mechanical or electrical intervention. And the water here has been flowing non-stop for 240 years and continues throughout the year, even in the rare occurrence of a dry Belgian summer. The garden's designer, Charles Alexis de Montpellier, was a local iron merchant, and he obviously really knew what he was doing here. His first task was to dig a 400-metre long canal at the highest point of his property, 28 hectares, and to fill it with water from a nearby natural spring. And after that, he constructed a complex network of interconnecting underground channels running from the canal. It was then a simple matter of just excavating about 20 pools and ponds and adorning them with over 50 fountains and cascades and waterfalls. It took him nearly 20 years to finish. And then he turned his attention to the gardens. But I think that the main feature is the use of water. The style of the gardens is quite mixed and was inspired by gardens like Versailles, but Italian gardens as well. Now we're going to move along quite a pace here into the 20th century, and we come to the Van Buuren Museum in Brussels. David and Alice van Buuren were wealthy Jewish collectors and patrons of the arts. The estate, the whole estate here, I think it's on about a hectare of land, was designed as a private house, and it became a museum after the deaths of David and Alice. And it's the most exquisite example of Art Deco design. That style features heavily both inside the house and in the garden, where we'll see some marvellous interiors. Notice here the use of... Art Deco was all about geometric shapes. Art Nouveau was more about flowing curves and counterintuitive curves that swung back on themselves. But in Art Deco, there's a lot of geometry. And just a few shots of some of the amazing interiors. And the thing that really impressed me was the quality of the finishes. It was just unbelievable quality and precision. And the carpets on the floor here, I think there's about 5 carpets that make up that pattern, but all beautifully woven for this house. The Van Buurens had a wonderful art collection. They counted people like the composer Erik Satie as a member of their circle of very cultured friends. And in fact, his piano is still here in the house. So you can imagine the soirees that would have taken place here. The Art Deco style has, as I said, been translated very cleverly into the design of the gardens. So much hedging with eruptions of more exuberant planting in between, but the structure of the plantings is very heavily evergreen, clipped evergreens, reflecting the style of the house interior. There was an ambition and intention always to have a maze somewhere on the property, and this maze, which is the most unusual shape, was not constructed till about 1968, and it was something they really didn't know how to tackle it originally, but Alice van Buuren really wanted to have this. And the maze is constructed upon the Song of Solomon, the book from the Old Testament, and there are these 7 rooms, and each one incorporates quotations from the Songs of Solomon and within rooms of greenery. Coming up with a maze on an irregular site like that, and also on a slope, when you think about most, well, I say maze, and that's incorrect. I should refer to it as a labyrinth. It's a place of meditation. A maze is more designed to entertain and divert, but a labyrinth is designed to encourage contemplation. When David van Buuren died, Alice van Buuren engaged the same landscape designer that they'd used elsewhere, including for the maze. His name was René Pecher. He's very well known in Belgium, to create what was called the Garden of the Heart in memory of her husband. It's one of those things you wander into and it can seem very static and, you know, a little bit in your face, but actually in the context of the whole garden, it's like the quiet point at the centre of everything else. So very, very effective. I'm moving ahead now to closer to our present times, and I'd like to say a little bit about the Belgian designer Marc Moris. And this is a lovely scene in his studio, and I think he has the most beautiful drafting table I've ever seen. It's a 19th century drafting table, and it is where he does all his work. He is a master of simplicity, and his work reflects the forms of nature and is in perfect harmony with the environment. His home, which is from where he practices, is called Moris Hof, and it shows traces of the influence of English landscape traditions, flower borders, meadow plantings, vegetable gardens, and the use of beech trees for hedging, and a broader park-like landscape. But there's really so much more to this garden. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the buildings here. This is the Moris Hof. A Hof is, like in German, a courtyard or an estate, really. And these buildings are all new. And this is something he does with his jobs. He designs looking back to traditional styles, but all these things are built out of retrieved materials. So the materials are all authentic and all done in the style, but of an era and something that looks quite at home in Flanders, in this part of the world. But I said that his work reflects the shapes of the environment and the shapes of nature and these wonderful, powerful hedging components to the gardens. But you see in the foreground here, there's water everywhere. So the challenge for landscape designers all over Belgium is to control and harness water. Looking back over a really lovely pond. And this was, until about 20 years ago, all a farm with just pastures. These very powerful shapes. And here we see a little of the English garden influence, the borders, and the borders here were really quite stunning. And I just love the way some of these species just reflected, these scabious in the foreground, reflecting that steep turret there in the background. Really very, very beautiful, very thoughtfully done. And some very interesting topiary. And until a few years ago, this was actually a cornfield, and they decided to restore it to a natural meadow. And they have worked very hard at this, and they've gradually reintroduced a whole lot of wildflowers and grasses that are native to this area. And there are several schools of thought about this approach. And as you would know, meadow plantings are very, very fashionable all over the world. But this movement, I guess, originated in Northern Europe, in countries like the Netherlands with Piet Blanckaert, and in Germany, and in parts of Scandinavia as well. And traditionally, these flowering meadows would be mown, and this would be mown as well. And there's one school of thought that believes you should not release the animals back into these areas to graze. But Marc Moris and his daughter, who practices with him, hold a very strong view that it's wise to let the animals back in, because as they trample around after everything's been cut back, they are padding and stamping the seeds into the ground. And this is what keeps the meadow going and keeps it vital and vitalised. So I think that juxtaposition of the hard and the soft, which is a kind of universal principle like the yin and the yang, the hard and the soft, we find it everywhere, and it must be something very basic about that, because it's always satisfying when you see this, the softness in the landscape there, and these firm, hard shapes flipped and placed randomly there. The juxtaposition works very nicely. Now we move on to another current Belgian designer, Chris Ghyselen, and he gardens also in Flanders, and he's known for his very naturalistic border plantings. He has a very, very good knowledge of design, as well as of rare and common and wild plants. And he combines the classical Flemish love of hedges with a passion for plants. He particularly loves the plant Persicaria. Now, not all Persicarias grow very well in Australia, but they are very much must-have plants in the Northern Hemisphere, and he actually breeds quite a lot of these. His garden is outside Bruges, and it's on heavy clay, which is good for perennials, but evergreens like taxus, which we call English or Irish yew, and buxus or box don't grow here, as the soil is just too muddy and wet in winter. So he's got to achieve these hedges using other plants, and the large hedges there are clipped hornbeam. So you have the bare shape of the structure through winter, and then it leaves up. I did visit Chris in his garden, and he was very charming. He is a very charming person. He's another very self-effacing designer. He has no website and no Facebook page. And I found that quite refreshing, because there are a lot of big egos in the landscape design industry, but he seems to be well enough known. The masterpiece in this garden is a wonderful long border which is flanked by curved beech hedges. I said hornbeam before. It is beech, which is closely related to hornbeam. And that wonderful serpentine, sinuous hedge there is really quite breathtaking. And at the end of this border, the garden becomes wilder with lawn and various water features, of course, but some really lovely perennial plantings here. And his colour combinations, these steely blues, I just found lovely. On the left here, this is one of the edges of his gardens, and you get that interface between the contained garden, the bit of mown lawn, and the wildness just beyond the fence. And a similar thing here, as if the meadow is constantly wanting to invade the garden. And I find that quite delightful. And scattered all around his garden, he has some delightful places to sit. His wife suffers from quite a debilitating illness, and so he's worked hard to create places where she can sit without having to walk too far from one place to another. But it really is the most beautiful garden, and you'll notice the height that some of these trees get to in that part of the world. And this is a pond that you come to at the end of that big perennial border. And he does nothing to manipulate the water level here. It just fills up when the water's around, and by late summer, it can often have dried right out. But he lives with that. And I liked his choice of deck chairs as well. Now we go to a private arboretum near Brussels, and there are a lot of arboreta in Belgium. An arboretum is basically a collection of trees or of certain genuses of trees. And this is the Kreftenbroek Arboretum, and it was created by a couple, the Van Kampenhoeds, and they were great plant lovers. And it was created in various stages. And Etienne Van Kampenhoed, he clarified his vision. I'll just quote him. "My garden is above all natural. An ordered but unhindered nature, a space where you feel life at every step, an organised garden, curbed by selection, composition and pruning. Pruned plants are not an end in themselves." I think this is quite important. "The topiary art is all intended to emphasise and structure freer plant growth." And there's this beautiful lagoon there. It had an algal bloom, but it was a good bloom. And they were great collectors of sculpture, and there are some wonderful things scattered through here. That is the work of a modern sculptor called Pierre Culot. It's called The Ruin, and I saw another example of his work somewhere else. So it's just sort of trying to set the garden in the context of past civilisations in this part of the world. But I would love to have taken a boat and gone out to that little landing. Another interesting water feature. Obviously, lots and lots of trees have been planted here, including lindens and horse chestnuts, holm oaks or evergreen oaks. And Mr. Van Kampenhoed said that on the subject of the trees that he'd planted, over the years, they will give this pasture the state, and it was all done on what was pasture land. They will give this pasture the stately appearance of the English parks of the 19th century, with only the winding hedges referring to some contemporary light-footedness. The next person I'd like to talk about is a man who has established a huge international reputation in the Northern Hemisphere as a landscape architect. I guess we don't hear so much here about these people, but they are very widely known and sought after on the continent and in the United States. This is Erik Dhont, who is based in Brussels. His portfolio includes a huge range of projects, private and public gardens, urban developments, farms, restoration work. And in all of these, his style is quite unmistakable. He sees garden design, of course, as an art form, and embraces this work with imagination. There's a fine aesthetic to his work, and it's always carefully balanced with functionality and with respect for environmental issues and the surrounding landscape. This is an aerial photo taken in a garden he was commissioned to do some years ago for the Belgian fashion designer Dries van Noten, and the garden is very closely guarded, very private place, but I just think that really has got to take the prize for the most creative hedging. You just feel you could push these things together. They provide such structure, but kind of embracing each other and the softer plantings in between. The way he works is quite interesting. He often makes models of the shapes that he wants to produce in his gardens. So he will have made this kind of model for those hedges you just saw. And this is a series of models he did. I'm sorry about the quality of the photo, but that was what he translated into this. And this is a celebrated garden of his in Normandy in France, where we've got these rather whimsical random shapes, and then emerging in between all this wonderful eruption of softer ephemeral planting. And the final piece of work that I'd like to mention of Erik Dhont is this wonderful modern take on a potager, a vegetable garden, and it's the vegetable garden that is attached to a celebrated restaurant outside of Brussels called the Chalet de la Forêt. And here the commission involved being able to grow all the vegetables and herbs and everything that they needed for the kitchens at this place. And it is, I think I mentioned, it's a 2-star Michelin restaurant. And just an idea of to get a scale, I think there's a person here must be pushing something, and there are these neat little areas where you can dine privately, but just all those fabulous textures. Just digressing for a minute here, another kind of landscape that is to be found in Belgium, and this is very popular with the tourists, of course, it's the tapis de fleurs, the carpet of flowers, that is a biennial event in Brussels and attracts millions of people, I think, and obviously they employ an awful lot of people to create this landscape. It is all marked out on the ground, and I think they come in very regularly and replace the flowers here. But this is on the Grand Place in the middle of Brussels. And just notice those fabulous buildings there. And all these towns seem to have fabulous town squares like this, with so much wonderful Flemish architecture. So I wanted to say something about the importance of flowers in Belgium. Many landscape designers are also florists, and many of them came to being landscape designers after working with floristry. And in fact, Erik Dhont, who I just mentioned, I was reading recently that when he was asked what sort of garden he'd most like for himself, and you saw all those very structured and controlled shapes, he would love to have a flower garden. So here is another man, Daniel Ost, who is a very successful landscape designer, but has acquired a really enviable reputation. And here, that's his floristry shop in Brussels. And you can see it's in one of the sort of gorgeous old Art Nouveau buildings. And here's an example of his work. So he creates landscapes, really, using flowers. And this would be something that had been done for a very upmarket wedding, but all done with flowers and a bit of lighting. And now I'm just saving what I think is the best till last, the work of the great Jacques Wirtz. I've read Jacques Wirtz described, along with Roberto Burle Marx, as the most influential garden designer of the 20th century. It's some words. Wirtz International, which has evolved from Jacques Wirtz's own practice, is now run by his two sons, Martin and Peter, and they have an amazing international clientele. In the late 1940s, Jacques Wirtz started out, he'd been forced during the Second World War just to grow vegetables for the Germans who had invaded Belgium. And he just started out with a wheelbarrow, growing flowers for florists and doing garden maintenance. And he slowly built a roster of clients. And this was the house that he bought at that time and around which has grown the most remarkable garden. He did a great deal of very minor work for many, many years. And it was only later in life that he came to any sort of prominence. He won the commission to design the garden for the Belgian pavilion at the Expo 70 in Oostkerke. And you can see he remained a great lover of flowers, and he always grew flowers. He particularly loved delphiniums, a little more of them in a minute. But I might just show you some images now. There's a little bit of the topiary. This is really an iconic view. The most wonderful, at least 100 metres long, avenue of box. And he'd acquired this land, and there were very degraded and overgrown box plants everywhere. And rather than remove them, he just started sculpting them. And he really created this most haunting and evocative landscape. And there are two paths that cross through this. I was very fortunate to be able to go there when no one else was there. I wanted to just quote a few things, and I might just show a few images while I do. A famous quote, a very powerful quote, I think, is, "A Wirtz garden is a thing of disquieting beauty." For Jacques Wirtz, this is another quote, the Belgian landscape guru who died on Saturday at the age of 93, a landscape was not about romantic meadows or tapestry-like herbaceous borders. He did not traffic in coziness or in nostalgia. His gestures were sweeping rather than twee, and his vision was that of a sculptor rather than a mosaicist. Expansive in spirit, even when the acreage is limited, his projects astonish the eye as much as they silence the tongue. And this last one, which is very, very haunting, that evocative hedge and the relationship with this crouching figure, the still water, the frothing water. His golden rule was an insistence on preserving the spirit of a place rather than putting his own stamp on it. A painterly handling of light and shadow like that of the 17th century painters. And I think that's quite brilliant, the way the light comes into that wintry landscape there. He was really renowned for his sculptural treatment of time-honoured garden staples like box and yew hedges. And he really possessed a virtuoso knowledge of plants and flowers. And to this day, this particular delphinium is always grown there because it was his favourite in his own garden. And Monty Don, in his series Around the World in 80 Gardens, in one episode there's a wonderful interview where Monty is interviewing Jacques Wirtz. It's worth hunting that out. So on that note, I'll leave you with this to digest. There's the man himself. Susanna.
Oh, Sandra, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. I'm tempted to, I'm actually doing my own tour in June this year, and I know that the tour this year is fully booked, but oh my goodness, I'm so tempted to join you. And I feel that anyone who goes traveling to that gorgeous part of the world with you is in for a real treat. So thank you for giving us such a wonderful, comprehensive view of Belgian gardens and explaining so many things and mentioning people I knew very little about. So I've learned an enormous amount, and I hope that others have as well. And if anybody has questions or comments, then please feel free to go ahead and ask Sandra.
Did I hear earlier on that Sandra was doing a Rhine trip in May next year?
Yes, that's the current tour involves Belgium and the Rhine Valley. So we spend 2 weeks in Belgium and a week going into the Rhine Valley. And one of the lovely things that we can do there is a Rhine cruise. And we believe that the boats are going to be running again. They weren't running through this last summer.
29th of May to the 18th of June next year.
Next year. Mm.
Yeah.
Sounds interesting. After looking at all those beautiful gardens, I'm like Susanna. I thought, wow, I have to change my ways of thinking. There's so much to see.
There's a very nice emphasis on art and the fine arts generally. And we do go to some fabulous galleries. Well, there's a huge range of art that has emanated from this part of the world, all the Northern Renaissance, the Flemish work, and then going through to Melbourne. There's so much. There's so much in the way of indoor treats as well as the outdoor treats.
Sandra, I noticed your map showing us the difference between Flanders and Walloon, I think it was.
Yes.
It looked like the border must have been a river valley.
Well, I think part of it would have been created by the course of rivers. Yes.
Yeah, it's very tortuous sort of a border, and I thought to myself, well, I thought it must be just one big river, but I can't think what its name would have been.
No, I think that the whole area is drained by a whole series of rivers. There's the Lyre, which is very celebrated for the flax from which we get linen. That is the home of Belgian linen, that part of the world, and it needs water to grow in. So since the time of the Romans, the landscape has been honed and shaped to make the most of water.
Thank you.
Ask one about the hedges, the amount of work that would be required to trim them. I'm just wondering if using different plantings made any difference, whether they don't grow as quickly, or box and some of those.
Yes, I'll tell you an interesting anecdote about Chris Ghyselen when I was there. He was sort of nursing his shoulder a bit, and he just told me that he did all the clipping, and that was, those big hornbeam hedges, about 4 metres high. And he had, I don't think he'd fallen off his ladder, but he'd clearly strained his shoulder by using I think it was a motorised hedge trimmer, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did a fair amount of hand clipping. And I tried to convince him that some of these things I know from experience, you really just have to hand on to younger people to do. There's quite an issue worldwide to do with box. Box blight has threatened to decimate a lot of gardens, particularly in Europe. And there are some well-known Australian designers who rely heavily on box, and we hope the blight doesn't get here, but I saw a lot of evidence. I've seen it in the past in Britain and in Germany too, and I was quite intrigued at the Wirtz garden. There was very, very little damage, and the same at Marc Moris's garden, and his daughter was telling me that they mix their own environmentally friendly mixes, and they feel they're controlling it. And I know here that they're suggesting you spray your box hedges with a mix of neem oil and eco oil. And I think you have to keep doing it, but you can stay on top of box, because if you think of certain styles of garden, if there was no box available, it would be diabolical. But I guess these people, one thing I didn't mention was Marc Moris. They have an enormous team of about 30 permanent employees, and they have their resident stonemasons, carpenters, sculptors, paviers, and obviously garden maintenance teams. And they are generally commissioned to look after the gardens they install. So I guess if you engage one of these really high-profile gardeners, there is a bit of an understanding that there will be an ongoing maintenance cost.
They are amazing.
They were certainly stunning hedges, weren't they?
I was just going to say they all had hedges. So it's is it just that they've copied the English, or is it a tradition of it over there?
I think there's a very strong tradition of hedging and water in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries. Yes, they're using water, and those are the elements. Trees, hedges and water are the elements of the landscape there. So that those landscape designers are very conversant with the requirements of all that sort of thing, but synonymous with the landscape, and have been since probably time immemorial. Because the box plant, I mean, you see it growing wild in France. It's a plant of that part of the world, really, sort of closer to the Mediterranean. And so it was obviously transported millennia ago and became a very handy tool in European garden design generally.
Do have a look on the website to see all of Sandra's forthcoming tours. As you can tell from her this year's one being fully booked, it's important to get a booking in early, and they certainly sound incredibly tempting. So Sandra, I'd like to say a very big thank you for being our second Travel Tuesday lecturer and for delighting our audience, way over 100 people tonight, so a fabulous turnout, and it has been a really fascinating talk. So thank you very much indeed from all of us here tonight. So from everyone here at ASA, once again, a very big thank you to Sandra for a fabulous talk, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.